is normally done is to withdraw the diplomat. If that does not happen, then to ask for his expulsion by declaring him persona non grata. Very rarely, no case comes to mind, does the government of the diplomat of the offending state, offending diplomat of the, do they ever give permission for diplomat to be tried according to local laws?
Okay.
Now, typically these things happen far more quietly than has happened here. And therefore there's a lot of furor and questions are being raised about diplomatic immunity and so forth.
Right.
But given the circumstances, I think this was the only sane solution to this problem, because you cannot, although there is a sense of moral outrage, and that is understandable because of the horrendous nature of the offense. If you start prosecuting diplomats and violate their immunity, then the first thing would happen would be a tit for tat.
Right.
And then your diplomats in that country could be picked up on some spurious charges and put behind jail. And so if this thing continues, soon you will have no diplomats left altogether. Which is why the whole concept of diplomatic immunity started, that, you know, this is the only way you can conduct relations, by giving some immunity to the officially accredited representatives of another state. If you don't do that, then you couldn't have any relations, because any tit for tat approach would mean that you'd really break off diplomatic relations. And this immunity started actually in the context of war, that when the war is being fought, then if you need to conduct talks to negotiate a peace, you send somebody with a white flag. Now if that person carrying the white flag is attacked and killed, how are you going to have discussions?
Right.
So in order to maintain the dialogue and discourse between sovereign states, you have to give some immunity to the official representatives of that state. The ambassador obviously has more rights than lower diplomats and so forth, but that's the basic principle.
Mr. Kapoor, how do you view this case? In many ways, you know, it's an unprecedented case wherein two countries are involved. The diplomat is from Saudi Arabia, and the women who have accused him of rape are from Nepal. In fact, Nepal's envoy has also protested to the flight of this family, and they want Saudi Arabia to pursue this case. And also the fact that, you know, India has gone ahead and named the diplomat, identified him, his name and designation are in public domain.
You know, as Ambassador Sikri said, there is nothing much that could have been done about the diplomat, because there is retaliation built into how you deal with the diplomat who's in your country. So surely all governments are very careful about it. They would ensure that you know, the offending diplomat either is pulled back by the government, or whatever you know happens, it should not, you know, jeopardize the relationship or hurt the relationship between the two countries. But now what has really happened, now there is a factor of the media which has been introduced. You also have this very active outrage industry which does not take into cognizance old, you know, diplomatic conventions, doesn't take into cognizance whatever the protocols that exist. So you have so much noise which is emanating out of, rightly so, I'm not actually in any ways making light of it, but there is so much of noise that suddenly people have begun to question the Vienna Convention.
Right.
They say that how can diplomats be allowed immunity when they are committing an ordinary crime? I mean, a crime of this such horrendous nature, and a very organized way. You have these women who are picked up routinely, has been carrying on for so long, and all the details that have been leaked by the police has fed this so-called outrage quarters in our society. So, you know, it becomes, I think, suddenly an issue where people want to treat even settled issues like the convention differently. They want to reopen and find ways to somehow hang the guilty and put governments that look here, the nature of norm building has changed compared to what it was earlier. If a crime is committed, and if you have civil society which is feeling extremely angry over it, it should be treated differently. But it is unlikely to happen. I mean, there's nothing that government of India would have done or Nepalese government would have done, because Saudi Arabia, smaller countries even, Saudi Arabia has no pushover. It's a fairly powerful country, very wealthy. We have about 2 million Indians who are working in those parts.
Right.
And if you treat Saudi Arabia shabbily, they're bound to retaliate. So this is the best thing that could have happened. But I'm sure a lot of people would say that, you know, diplomatic immunity should be waived, or the government of India put pressure on the Saudi Arabians to somehow, waive the immunity so that person could be tried, whether in his own country or here. So those kind of noises will continue for a while.
Ambassador Goyal, how do you view this entire case and India's handling of it, considering that we find ourselves, in a sense, wedged between a rock and a hard place, given the fact that Nepal is also involved here?
I think a lot has been said by Ambassador Sikri and Mr. Kapoor. Let me bring in a different dimension to the whole thing. It's quite correct, really speaking, that it would be difficult life for a diplomat to function in, if I can use the word alien, because ultimately it is actually the host country where the laws could be different from the laws, and basically where the working environment could create difficulties, and therefore you need to have certain immunities and privileges to be able to discharge your duties effectively. That does not give license to them to indulge in heinous crimes like rape or murder and things of that kind. Yes, but the fact is that if an escape valve is available to them, they will use escape valve. And as Ambassador Sikri said, no sending government is ever going to allow its diplomats to be tried in a local court, because it opens up a Pandora's box. All kinds of charges can be then cooked up, created, like in the case of, if you remember, there were allegations that most of the charges in the case of Devyani Khobade were actually, they were not genuine charges really. There were lots of explanations. We cannot question as to whether they were correct or incorrect. But the fact is that there is always a possibility of diplomats being tried in the local courts of law for vengeance, for different reasons, if there is a possibility of this kind. And Vienna Convention actually safeguards the personal safety of these diplomats against those things. Let me give you one small anecdote here, and these are all reciprocal. Even in a country like Saudi Arabia, where, I mean, we all know that being the Islamic society that it is, no diplomat can ever, or nobody can ever import even a drop of alcohol. But how do these diplomatic missions function? They are allowed to import alcohol or buy alcohol, etc. And in fact, there is an anecdotal thing that when they actually give the bill declaring what it contains, they say it contains old clothes or household effects. And once a crate of alcohol broke, and the custom officer called the ambassador saying, "Excellency, your old clothes and the household effects are leaking and are stinking. Please collect them immediately." So these things happen. I think what has happened is really that now the civic society pressures have become very important.
Right.
Any such thing happening there, instead of really being dealt with in a quiet, more mature, in a manner that it doesn't create difficulties between the governments, it immediately becomes a civic society issue, which is good in a certain way,
right,
but it does create difficulties for the governments. Second thing, which I think is rather exceptionable for me, is that everybody now wants to grab headlines. I don't understand why. I'm not at all excusing the gravity of the crime, but if the Gurgaon police knew that the person involved in the crime is a diplomat, a Saudi Arab diplomat, where was the need for the information to be leaked to the media or the other groups before consulting the Ministry of External Affairs or the Ministry of Home Affairs? I mean, one should understand that there are situations which require more intelligent handling than just grabbing headlines. So I think essentially a lot of furor has come up because of the civic society pressures, because of the media highlights and so on and so forth. But under the circumstances, there was no other way for the case to be dealt with except allowing the diplomat to go back to his country and be tried over there under the local laws.
Ambassador Sikri, there is the Saudi media has criticized, the Gurgaon police for breaking into the premises of their diplomat. How do you view, this particular?
Well,
incident?
taking up the point which Ambassador Goel just said, all police officers and all police stations are not always sufficiently sensitized to diplomatic immunities. The police station in Chanakyapuri would certainly be. But somebody in Gurgaon is not used to dealing with diplomats, so he may not have been aware that these are diplomats. And here I want to make a distinction between diplomats, people with diplomatic status, and others who could be officials or businessmen, just foreigners. Now, if you are a foreigner but without diplomatic status, you have no immunity.
Right.
So maybe the police, Gurgaon police thought that they were, just foreigners.
And not all staff of the embassy enjoys
just want
diplomatic
to add one
immunity.
thing more. It wasn't so simple because you had a police security which was provided because 14 flats in that entire
That's
premises.
all right.
But so there was recognition that diplomats were staying here.
No. I have lived in Moscow in Soviet times, and every building where the foreigners were living had security. Whether you were a diplomat or a businessman or